Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another segment of our daily reflections on the Mass readings. Today is August 24th, and we're looking at the Gospel. Today from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 45 to 51. Now, today's Gospel is about one man's first encounter with Jesus, and that man is Nathaniel. Now, that's a curious thing right from the get-go, because today is the feast day of St. Bartholomew the Apostle. So the question we might ask, reasonably enough, is, well, why are we reading a passage about Nathaniel's encounter with Jesus if today is the feast day of St. Bartholomew? And the reason why is because the Church, in her tradition, generally tends to identify these two figures. That the same person who is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the book of Acts as the Apostle Bartholomew is mentioned in John's Gospel as Nathaniel. It appears, at least in the Church's tradition, that these two are one and the same person. So that's why we're looking at Nathaniel today. It's a story about Nathaniel the Apostle. At any rate, it's interesting that we don't know all that much about Nathaniel. All right? We're told in today's Gospel that he was a friend of another apostle, the Apostle Philip. We are told in the Gospel of John later on in chapter 21 that Nathan was from Cana of Galilee, so he's a Galilean. He actually didn't live that far from the town of Nazareth, where Jesus himself grew up. We also know, and this is the important thing in today's reading, that Nathaniel begins the story as a skeptic, but he ends the story as a believer. All right, so what we have today is the story of an encounter with Jesus that brings about a conversion, all right, of a man who was skeptical and who then comes to faith and confesses his faith in Jesus as the Son of God and the King of Israel. So let's look at this text today. It begins in verse 45. This is the very end of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. It says that Philip, who was one of the apostles, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." All right? So Philip comes to Nathanael and says, "We found him." Well, who did you find, Philip? Who is the we? The we are the apostles. Who did you find? We found a man who is the living embodiment of the scriptures of Israel. And this is sounding a very important note, not just for the whole gospel tradition or the Gospel of John, but for even just for today's episode. Because what we're going to see is that Jesus' role is already present, both in the law of Moses, we'll see that at the end of the episode, and then even before that, how Jesus was foretold by the prophets. Okay, so this one verse here, "We have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote," sort of flutters like a banner over this whole episode. We're about to see Scripture fulfilled before Nathanael's very eyes. All right, and so Nathanael responds. Nathanael said to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Now, this is a curious comment. This is obviously the perspective of a local, right? Because Nathanael is from Cana. Cana is only a handful of miles away from Nazareth. And one thing that Nathanael knows about Nazareth is that it could not be more unimportant. It's this backwater village, and there's no real significance attached to it. It's not even mentioned in the Old Testament. So can we really think that the fulfillment of all of Israel's scriptures could somehow come out of this little place, this little hole in the wall that nobody even knows about? That doesn't even make sense. All right? And so what's the response to that? Nathanael says to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip responds, "Come and see." All right? And that's the invitation for us today, is the invitation to discipleship. Don't take my word for it. Come and see. Come and see this man. Verse 47, "And Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said, 'Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile.'" I think that what we have here is an instance of irony, okay? Jesus is speaking within the tradition of the Old Testament, okay? He's an Israelite. Nathaniel's an Israelite. What does that mean? Well, it means that he's a descendant of Jacob. You remember the patriarch Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, had 12 sons, and his 12 sons begot the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you are an Israelite, you're a descendant of Jacob, okay? But this is a true descendant of Jacob, Jesus says, in whom there is no guile, in whom there is no deceit. And this is where the irony comes in. Because if you remember the stories about Jacob in the book of Genesis, you know that Jacob was a beguiling figure. He was a deceiver. He was the one who used trickery to intercept the blessing that was intended for his brother Esau. Right? He wore skins. He sat before his father when his father couldn't see. Isaac's eyes were growing dim, and he tricked him into getting the blessing that was supposed to be for Esau. So Jacob was a trickster of sorts. He was a deceitful man in some ways, and yet here, ironically, we have a man in whom there is no guile, which is quite a compliment for Nathaniel, coming from the lips of Jesus. Now Nathaniel responds to this comment. Nathaniel said to him, "How do you know me?" In other words, Jesus and Nathaniel hadn't met prior to this point. "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Listen to the response that Nathaniel gives to Jesus. "Before Philip called you, you were under the fig tree, and I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Now that's a marvelous confession of faith. But I think that if we're reading this story, we're asking ourselves the question, how did you get from A to B? How does this comment, "You saw me sitting under a fig tree," bring about or generate this confession of faith, "You are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel"? There seems to be a disproportion there. This seems to be quite overstated as a response to a very simple bit of information. The reason I think, and what's going on here in the background, is that certain biblical prophecies are beginning to converge in Nathaniel's mind. All right, and now the pieces are starting to snap together, and all of a sudden he sees something that he hadn't seen previously. What does he see? Well, Jesus said, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Two things here. One, Philip is calling his friend, his neighbor, his brother, Nathaniel. That's the first detail. And the second thing is that he calls him under a fig tree. Now that probably takes us back to the Old Testament book of Zechariah. We're just going to turn there just for a minute to try and get a sense of why those details, which don't exactly jump off the page at us, especially if we're not familiar with this prophecy, why in fact they are significant. So let's go back to Zechariah chapter 3. In Zechariah 3, Zechariah is one of the minor prophets. If you're not sure where that is, go to the Psalms and hang a right, and you end up after Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in the minor prophets. In this text, in Zechariah 3, we are told of this encounter between the Lord and Joshua, the high priest, part of the restored Jewish community that had come back from Babylonian exile, and now they're rebuilding their life in the land of Israel. And the Lord has gives this vision to Joshua, and he speaks to him and actually takes away his iniquity. And then he says something else about another figure who is not the high priest Joshua, and who is not one of the other returnees, so far as we can tell, but who is a figure known as the branch. Okay, and I'll explain the significance of that. We'll pick up in verse 8 of chapter 3. Okay. "Hear now, O Joshua the high priest," this is the Lord speaking, "you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. Behold, I will bring my servant the branch," which is a very mysterious title. Okay, "I will bring my servant the branch, for behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its description. Its inscription declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. So there's some sort of relationship between this servant figure who's a branch and the expiation of sin in God's land. I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite or call, is another perfectly legitimate translation, call his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. So when Jesus says, when Philip called you and you were under the fig tree, if this prophecy springs to mind, then Nathaniel realizes he's in that day, in this great day when God raises up his servant, the branch, and eliminates the sins of his people. And so that raises the question, who is this branch? My servant, the branch, is a reference to the Davidic Messiah. Okay, the Davidic Messiah. We're going to explain this in light of a passage that appears in the prophet Isaiah. But in this context, the branch is a sprig or a sprout that comes up from a fallen tree stump. Okay, the tree has been fallen, the stump is all that remains, and yet life remains in it. Okay, and this is actually a picture of what happened historically to God's people, is that the Davidic monarchy was cut off in 586 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah was destroyed and taken into exile by the Babylonians. And so it looked like the Davidic monarchy, the whole covenant of kingship that God made with David, had come to a decisive and permanent end. But in fact, it hadn't. There is still life there. It's something that will be restored in this particular figure, this branch that grows out of the stump. He will be the Messiah. He represents the scion of the royal house of David. Okay, so that's the first thing. And that helps us to make sense of why Nathaniel would respond to Jesus, "You are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Because that's who the Davidic Messiah is. He's the King of Israel. But this is not the only passage that seems to be resonating in the background. There's also one in Isaiah 11, where you have the same sort of image, okay, referring to the same figure, all right, and in a passage that's basically has the same import, the same significance. In Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, and so on and so forth. And it goes on to show that this branch, it's a different Hebrew word in this passage, but this branch comes forth from a stump. It shows that there's new life and that he is the scion of the royal house of David once again. Now, these two things appear to come together. These two prophecies converge in the mind of Nathaniel when Jesus speaks to him for two reasons. One, the first passage appears to be evoked when Jesus says that before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree. Well, this is a prophecy that says that when God accomplishes these great things with the Davidic Messiah, each man will call his neighbor when they're under the fig tree. So that's the Zechariah branch. But then there's another thing. Remember what Nathaniel just said about Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, as a matter of fact, Nazareth is significant, okay? At least since the time of St. Jerome in the 4th century, and probably already there in the Gospel of Matthew in the very 1st century, there's a connection between the town of Nazareth and this prophecy from Isaiah, because the branch that grows from his roots is the Netzer. The Netzer is the branch, and Netzer appears to be related to Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus the Nazarene. So the branch is in fact related to Nazareth. So Nathaniel is confronted by these words of Jesus, which are mysterious and don't seem to be significant, and yet all of a sudden prophecies are coming together. And the portrait of this man standing before him is in fact a living embodiment of Scripture, the Scriptures of Israel fulfilled. In this case, Zechariah's branch and Isaiah's branch is standing before him and addressing him. And that's what accounts for this grandiose confession of faith. But there's more here, because Jesus goes on in John 1. Excuse me, I turned to Zechariah. In John 1, Nathaniel answers him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. And Jesus answers, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? That's precisely why, isn't it? You will see even greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So what's going on here? Jesus is saying, I am the branch. I am the Davidic Messiah that is awaited by my people. But even more than the Messiah, I'm the one mediator between heaven and earth. And in fact, when Jesus says these words, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man, he's actually referring to another Old Testament passage. All right? Now we're moving past the prophets and going back into the law of Moses, right? Just as Philip said, we have found him of whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets. Okay, now we're back in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 28, you'll remember the story of Jacob's ladder, where Jacob has a dream at a place called Bethel. And he sees this ladder spanning the distance between heaven and earth, and he sees angels coming down and angels going up. And what he realizes is that God is in that place. In fact, the very name Bethel, which is the place where Jacob is sleeping and having this dream, means the house of God. It's the place where heaven touches down to earth, where the angels are ministering God's will, bringing God's blessings down and carrying up the petitions of God's people up to him, going back. And so you have this mediation, this point of contact between heaven and earth. And Jesus is now putting himself at the very center of that dream. He's identifying the stairway or the ladder with himself. He is the one mediator between heaven and earth, and he's uniquely qualified for that, isn't he? Because our faith teaches us that he is both God and man. He is the only bridge that touches both shores, the shores of God's divinity as well as the shores of our humanity. And so he is uniquely qualified to be that one mediator and, in fact, to be the Bethel, the house of God among us. Jesus, in his humanity, is a temple of the presence of God. So what are we seeing here in this passage at the end of John 1? We're asking the question, who is Jesus? And this episode answers in several ways. Jesus is Zechariah's branch. Jesus is Isaiah's shoot from the stump. Jesus is Jacob's ladder. And then finally, Jesus becomes Nathaniel's saving Lord and King. I hope some of these reflections were helpful to you on a sort of a challenging passage of Scripture. I pray that God blesses you and your family in your day, and we'll see you here again next time. Thanks.